Nikola Tesla is one of the greatest scientific minds of all time.
Without Tesla's invention of alternating current technology, it would be a much darker and quieter world.
On October 15th, 2026, two scientists examining a forgotten collection of electrical engineering records made a discovery that seemed to connect directly to one of the strangest chapters in Nikola Tesla's life. Inside an overlooked archive were references to Wardenclyffe, missing technical papers, and an experiment that Tesla himself believed could change the way humanity received electricity. But one detail was especially disturbing. The records appeared to point toward a test far more ambitious than the wireless telegraphy project Tesla had publicly described. If the documents were authentic, they suggested that Tesla had been attempting to make the Earth itself part of a gigantic electrical circuit. And somewhere in the surviving records was a clue to what happened on the night he allegedly pushed the system beyond its intended limits. The discovery began in a quiet research facility where Dr. Elena Markovich, a physicist specializing in historical electrical systems, was reviewing digitized documents with Dr. Daniel Reeves, a historian of technology. The two had been studying Tesla's Wardenclyffe project for months, but they were not expecting to find anything new. Most of the story was already familiar. The tower, J.P. Morgan's financing, Tesla's experiments, and the eventual collapse of the project. Then Reeves stopped scrolling. "Elena, look at this date," he said. She leaned toward the screen and read the entry again. It referenced an electrical disturbance associated with the Wardenclyffe site and contained a handwritten notation that neither researcher immediately understood. "Could this be connected to Tesla's final experiments?" she asked. Reeves hesitated. "If it is, then we're looking at something that changes the story completely." To understand why that possibility was so extraordinary, they had to go back more than a century to the early 1900s, when a strange wooden structure was rising on the Long Island coast. Tesla's facility at Shoreham, New York, was called Wardenclyffe Tower, and it looked unlike almost anything that had ever been constructed in the United States. A wooden lattice framework, nearly 187 feet tall, was crowned by a massive copper-clad dome and stood against the flat landscape like an industrial cathedral. To ordinary observers, it appeared to be another eccentric invention from an already eccentric genius. But Tesla's plans went far beyond sending messages through the air. The tower was intended to become part of a much larger experiment involving electricity, resonance, the atmosphere, and the Earth itself. Tesla did not think about invention in the same way as many of his contemporaries. He often described constructing machines mentally before building them physically, imagining their moving parts and electrical behavior in extraordinary detail. His approach was dramatically different from the trial-and-error methods associated with inventors such as Thomas Edison, who had briefly employed Tesla during the 1880s before their professional relationship deteriorated. Tesla believed that electricity could be controlled through frequency, resonance, and carefully designed oscillating systems. And by the beginning of the 20th century, he was convinced that the planet itself might become part of an enormous electrical network. The money to turn that vision into reality came from one of the most powerful financiers in America, J.P. Morgan. Morgan agreed to provide approximately $150,000 for Wardenclyffe, expecting Tesla to develop a wireless communication system capable of transmitting information without physical cables. At the time, that goal alone was revolutionary. In December 1901, Guglielmo Marconi had demonstrated transatlantic wireless signaling, sending the Morse code letter S across the Atlantic and intensifying the international race to control wireless communication. Morgan understood the commercial and strategic importance of such technology. What he apparently did not fully appreciate was how far Tesla intended to take it. Tesla wasn't satisfied with sending a signal, Dr. Markovich explained as she examined the old technical drawings. He wanted to transmit energy. Reeves nodded. "And that's where the story becomes complicated," he replied. Tesla envisioned a system in which electrical energy could be transmitted without conventional wires, potentially allowing distant receivers to draw power from a common electromagnetic system. But the modern claim that Tesla had already achieved unlimited free electricity is much harder to establish. The surviving evidence demonstrates remarkable wireless energy experiments, but it does not prove that Wardenclyffe successfully delivered unlimited electrical power anywhere on Earth. That distinction, Markovich warned, was critical. "We're not looking for a legend," she said. "We're looking for what Tesla actually built." Tesla's experiments at Colorado Springs between 1899 and 1900 were central to that vision. There, he constructed enormous electrical apparatus capable of producing spectacular discharges and studied the behavior of high-frequency currents and resonance. He became increasingly interested in the possibility that electrical oscillations could interact with the Earth itself. His notes explored the relationship between resonance, conductivity, and the planet's natural electrical properties. To Tesla, Colorado Springs was more than a laboratory. It was a proof-of-concept environment in which he could test whether the Earth and atmosphere might participate in the transmission of electrical energy. When he returned to New York, the vision became larger. At Wardenclyffe, Tesla planned a system that combined a powerful electrical oscillator with the enormous conducting properties of the Earth and atmosphere. Underground components were incorporated into the design, while the tower and its dome formed the visible portion of the installation. The objective was to create an electrical system capable of transmitting signals and, eventually, power over great distances. Tesla believed that if the correct frequency and resonance could be achieved, energy could travel through natural electrical pathways rather than depending entirely on conventional copper wires. But that ambition created a problem. The technology Tesla was pursuing had almost no established commercial model. A communication signal could be transmitted, received, and potentially charged for. Electrical power was different. A conventional utility could measure how much electricity a customer consumed and charge accordingly. A global wireless energy system would require an entirely different infrastructure and business model. Tesla's dream was technological. Morgan's investment was financial. And somewhere between those two visions, the relationship began to fracture. "Do you think Morgan understood the full plan when he invested?" Reeves asked. Markovich paused before answering. "He knew Tesla wanted wireless transmission. The real question is how much he understood about the power transmission ambitions." She pointed toward another document on the screen. Tesla had repeatedly spoken publicly about transmitting electrical energy without wires, so the basic idea was certainly not secret. But the scale of his vision was extraordinary. He imagined a world in which energy could potentially be transmitted across enormous distances without the dense network of wires and substations that would later become the foundation of modern electrical distribution. By 1903, however, the project was running into serious financial and engineering difficulties. The tower was unfinished, Tesla needed additional funding, and his plans were becoming increasingly ambitious. Morgan had already invested heavily, but Tesla wanted more. The financier was reportedly unwilling to continue supporting an increasingly expensive project without a clear commercial return. The tower that had once represented the future of wireless communication was becoming a monument to a technology whose practical purpose remained uncertain. And then came the part of the story that continues to fascinate researchers today. Tesla began conducting experiments that pushed the equipment toward its limits. The surviving historical record does not establish the dramatic secret test described in later legends, nor does it prove that Tesla successfully powered distant communities through the Earth. But the real experiments were extraordinary enough without adding a fictional ending. Tesla had demonstrated wireless transmission effects, investigated electrical resonance on a massive scale, and pursued a vision that was decades ahead of the infrastructure required to make it practical. The two scientists returned to the newly discovered document. Reeves enlarged the image until the handwriting filled the screen. "This notation doesn't look like a normal construction record," he said. Markovich studied it silently. "No," she replied, "it looks like an observation." They compared the date with surviving records from Wardenclyffe and Colorado Springs. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Markovich noticed something that made her sit back. The document appeared to reference a measurement taken during the Wardenclyffe period that had never been discussed in the standard accounts of Tesla's project. "Daniel," she said quietly, "if this is genuine, we may finally have a reason to ask what Tesla was actually measuring." Outside the laboratory, the modern electrical grid continued humming exactly as it had for generations. But inside the archive, two scientists were staring at a century-old clue connected to a tower that had once promised to change the way humanity understood electricity. Wardenclyffe had been demolished long ago. Tesla had died in 1943, and much of the world had forgotten the scale of his ambition. Yet, the documents remained, and if the next records in the collection could confirm what the first one appeared to suggest, the mystery would no longer be about whether Tesla dreamed of wireless power. It would be about exactly how far he managed to take that dream before Wardenclyffe went dark. The night of the experiment. One night in the spring of 1903, with the nearby town asleep and no reporters or investors present, Tesla decided to push the system toward its full capacity for the first time. Until that moment, Wardenclyffe had been a construction site, a laboratory, and a promise of what wireless technology might eventually become. But that night, Tesla wanted more than a demonstration. He wanted to know whether the enormous structure he had built could actually make the Earth and atmosphere behave as parts of a single electrical system. No official records were made of what happened. The absence of a formal record would later become one of the strangest parts of the story. According to the assistant's account, recorded in her own words many years later, Tesla began by inspecting the underground grounding network, the iron pipe system that connected the tower's electrical core to the water table below. This section had always been restricted, even from most of his own staff. Tesla treated it as the most sensitive component of the entire design, checking each connection personally before returning to the control room. The concept was that, when the tower's oscillating coils were powered up, energy would surge downward through the ground system, while the dome simultaneously projected a matching electrical field upward into the atmosphere. Earth below and sky above would function as two terminals of a planetary-scale circuit. A receiver tuned to the same resonant frequency could, in Tesla's vision, tap into that circuit from a distant location. Whether the system could actually operate on anything close to the global scale, Tesla imagined remained unproven. But that night, he intended to push the experiment further than before. Tesla stood at the main control switch. He gave his assistant a small, quiet nod. She moved toward the instruments and prepared to record the readings. For several seconds, nothing happened. The tower stood motionless against the darkness, its enormous dome barely visible above the surrounding trees. Then Tesla placed his hand on the control mechanism and activated the power. The machinery started with a low hum that deepened quickly. The sound traveled through the structure, growing louder and more powerful with every second. The copper coils inside the tower began to vibrate. The floor beneath their feet trembled. Static built in the air, raising the hairs on their arms. Sparks crawled across instrument rails and metal surfaces, jumping from one point to another like tiny flashes of blue fire. Then the dome released a blinding arc of white-blue electricity that reached into the sky above it. It was not a brief flash. According to the later account, the discharge appeared to hang in the air, sustained for several seconds before changing shape and intensity. The entire structure seemed to glow from within. People living miles away later claimed that the sky above Shoreham had suddenly brightened, producing a strange illumination unlike anything they had seen before. But the light was not the most disturbing part. Along the shoreline, several miles distant, isolated homes and small buildings with no known electrical connection suddenly appeared to glow. Lamps flickered into life as if invisible switches had been thrown. Some reportedly illuminated only briefly, while others remained lit long enough for people nearby to notice that something unusual was happening. The assistant stood watching in disbelief. Tesla did not react. He remained motionless at the instruments, whispering calculations and tracking the rapidly changing readings. His attention was fixed entirely on the gauges. Then the needles began to behave strangely. They jumped past their highest calibrated positions, slammed against the limits of the instruments, and began moving unpredictably. At nearly the same time, telegraph operators across Long Island began reporting interference. Signals became distorted. Some stations experienced complete communication failure. Others reported sudden electrical disturbances that seemed to have no obvious source. Tesla's assistant realized that something had changed inside the system. The problem was no longer simply the amount of energy being produced. It was the behavior of the energy after it entered the system. Too much current appeared to be returning through the ground circuit faster than the regulators could handle. The resonance between the tower's coils and the surrounding electrical environment was becoming unstable. Instead of remaining controlled, the system appeared to be feeding energy back into itself. Copper windings began to overheat. A sharp smell of burning insulation filled the control room. Smoke appeared near one of the generators. Tesla was already moving toward the main control lever before his assistant could reach him. He cut the power with a single, sharp motion. The arc above the dome vanished. The vibration stopped. The sound died. And suddenly, there was nothing. The silence that followed felt, according to the assistant, almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened in the absence of whatever had just been present. The instruments slowly returned toward normal. The smell of overheated equipment remained in the room. Outside, the darkness had returned to the shoreline. Tesla stood gripping the control handle for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "It works." His assistant later said she heard something unexpected in those two words. Not triumph, not satisfaction, fear. Tesla told her that the results had exceeded his expectations. He told her they would need to test again under stricter controls. Then his tone changed. He instructed her to say nothing to anyone, not to the maintenance staff, not to investors, not to visitors. Whatever had happened that night, he did not want the information leaving the facility. He feared that word of the result reaching the wrong people could end the project before he had a chance to understand what he had achieved. The two began shutting down the control room. Instruments were switched off one by one. Access doors were secured. The tower slowly returned to darkness. That was when the assistant noticed something beyond the fence. At the tree line stood several silhouettes. Men. They were grouped together, completely still, watching the tower. For a moment, she assumed they were local residents who had been drawn outside by the strange light. But then she realized something that made her uneasy. They were not approaching. They were not talking. They were simply watching. She turned toward Tesla and pointed toward the trees. He looked in that direction and remained silent. The men wore dark, unmarked clothing. She did not recognize them as members of Tesla's staff. They were not journalists, and she could not identify them as anyone connected directly to Morgan's organization. Most disturbing of all, they did not appear surprised by what they had witnessed. They looked as though they had been expecting it. The observers who shouldn't have been there. By the following morning, before any newspaper had reported anything and before any official statement had been made, word had already begun moving through private channels. Tesla received a hand-delivered letter within hours of sunrise. According to the later account, it came from a representative of J.P. Morgan personally. The letter's tone was not congratulatory. It expressed serious concern about what it described as uncontrolled power dissemination, particularly the possibility that Tesla's system was broadcasting electrical energy in ways that could not be reliably tracked, measured, contained, or commercially controlled. Tesla reportedly read the letter more than once. Then he folded it and placed it inside his desk. There were additional whispers, which the assistant later claimed to have documented, about foreign observers. According to these accounts, individuals from outside the United States had been informed in advance about the test and had arrived to witness it from a distance. The assistant became convinced that some form of government monitoring, domestic or foreign, had been active around the site before the experiment concluded. Whether those observers were actually government agents, private investigators, military personnel, or simply curious onlookers remains impossible to establish from the surviving evidence. But one fact remained fixed in her memory. The men at the tree line had been there before the experiment began, and they had stayed until it ended. That detail changed the way she understood the entire night. What had crossed a threshold was not simply a scientific experiment. Wardenclyffe had been, up to that point, a controversial but potentially fundable private project. Tesla could still present the tower as a wireless communication facility and argue that its larger ambitions belonged to the future. But if the system had demonstrated meaningful wireless energy transmission at significant distances, the implications were much larger. A technology capable of delivering electrical power without conventional transmission lines could potentially bypass enormous portions of the existing energy infrastructure. It threatened not only established business models, but also the economic and strategic advantages created by controlling electrical distribution. Copper wires, transformer stations, generating facilities, and metering systems had become the foundation of the emerging electrical age. A radically different system could challenge all of them. And energy was never merely about electricity. It was about money. It was about industry. It was about transportation, communication, manufacturing, and military power. Nations that controlled energy supplies or electrical infrastructure possessed enormous strategic advantages. A technology capable of transmitting energy without conventional infrastructure could eventually weaken those advantages. Tesla had not set out to threaten anyone. He had set out to serve everyone. But the world he was trying to improve was not necessarily prepared to abandon the mechanisms of control that were already shaping the modern age. And as the scientists examining the old records would later discover, the events following that night were almost as mysterious as the experiment itself. Within days, Tesla's financial support began to disappear. Access to the facility changed. Documents that had once been available to his team became difficult to locate. And the tower that had been designed to demonstrate the future of wireless energy began moving, slowly and almost silently, toward its final shutdown. The aftermath and sudden shutdown. Within days of the letter arriving, the atmosphere around Wardenclyffe changed completely. J.P. Morgan withdrew his financial support, and there was no extended negotiation, No grace period, and no restructured agreement. The funding simply stopped. Tesla's engineers, builders, and assistants began disappearing almost immediately, because without capital, he could no longer meet payroll or continue purchasing the equipment required to complete the tower. Deliveries stopped arriving, construction froze, and Wardenclyffe, once presented as a symbol of the future, suddenly looked like a project being abandoned in real time. But the money was only the first blow. Shortly after the funding disappeared, officials began arriving at the site, presenting themselves as inspectors conducting safety reviews or investigating patent and electrical code concerns. Their language was bureaucratic and procedural, but according to the assistant's later account, their behavior felt nothing like an ordinary inspection. They moved through Tesla's restricted workspaces, entered areas that had previously been closed to outsiders, examined specialized equipment, and looked through research materials that Tesla considered among his most sensitive possessions. Then the crates appeared. Large wooden crates began leaving the facility, carrying precision instruments, custom-fabricated tools, and components associated with Tesla's wireless energy experiments. More troubling, according to the later account, were the documents that seemed to disappear at the same time. Tesla's laboratory journals, technical drawings, calculations, and research notes were no longer where they had been stored. These were not ordinary papers. They contained the technical reasoning behind Wardenclyffe, including the frequencies Tesla was investigating, his ground coupling experiments, his atmospheric transmission calculations, and the receiver designs he hoped would eventually complete a global wireless network. Without those documents, reconstructing the system would have been extremely difficult. With them, it might have been possible. Yet no agency publicly acknowledged removing them. No complete receipt was presented. No detailed transfer record became available. And no clear explanation emerged for why materials belonging to a private inventor had suddenly moved beyond the reach of the people who had been working with him. Tesla himself appeared to change after the collapse of Wardenclyffe. The assistant later described him as quieter, more isolated, and visibly diminished. He continued working privately, filling notebooks with theoretical ideas and developing smaller inventions, but he never again attempted anything on the same scale. There were no more demonstrations comparable to the vision he had pursued on Long Island. When the assistant eventually asked him whether he intended to revive the project, she claimed that Tesla looked at her for a moment before answering, "They realized it worked, and that is why they stopped it." Whether those words were ever spoken exactly as remembered is impossible to establish. But the decline of Wardenclyffe itself is documented. The tower remained unused for years, and Tesla's financial problems continued to worsen. Eventually, the structure was dismantled in 1917 and sold for scrap, officially in connection with his debts. The tower that had once represented Tesla's greatest wireless ambitions was reduced to pieces of timber and metal, leaving behind an empty site and a question that would survive long after the structure itself had disappeared.